When emotional abuse is involved, it's involving another person, and this adds a little extra layer to things. In my head. Hey everybody, if you're new here, I do mental health videos Monday through Friday, and I'm all about humanizing mental health. So if you think that mental health could use a little bit more humanity in it, hit subscribe and hit the bell after you subscribe to get notified each time that I do a video. In this video, we're going to be talking about hypervigilance after emotional abuse. After emotional abuse, we become hypervigilant. There's reasons for it. We'll talk about it. What do we do about it? We're going to talk about it tonight. When somebody goes through emotional abuse, what we need to understand is that this is happening with somebody that's close to them. Typically, if somebody's going to say something emotionally abusive to you, and I should make the distinction here that everybody does things that are emotionally abusive, but we don't do them as a pattern. When somebody does this as a pattern, it's because they're near you. So they're either somebody that you work with, somebody in your family, a loved one, and typically in those situations, it's not so easy to just leave. You may have a little bit more wiggle room with a career, but if it's a family, especially if you're a young person in that family, or if it's a loved one, there's finances involved, there's a lot of work to move and to get out of that situation, which should be done if you are in a situation with an emotionally abusive person and they're not changing their behaviors. But it's important to understand this because this is why hypervigilance happens, and this is why people sometimes become traumatized in an emotionally abusive situation. So if somebody's traumatized, if they develop PTSD, and this is something that very often happens when somebody has child abuse specifically, because we don't have defenses and we don't have resources to get away from those people, then we start to develop hypervigilance. I have an example of hypervigilance here that you can watch. I'll link to it above somewhere. Maybe not now, maybe a little bit later in the videos, just so you can watch this whole video and then go back and watch that one. But hypervigilance is basically feeling like you have to be on guard for threats at all time, and you're constantly scanning your environment, looking for threats so that you can combat against them. And this is a reaction to always being under threat. And when somebody's emotionally abusing you, they're constantly sending you the message that you are threatened, that sometimes emotional abuse comes along with physical abuse, and so the emotional abuse is the precursor to the physical abuse. Like, I hate you, I'm gonna hurt you, and then they go ahead and hurt you. And it's also putting you in a one-down position, and it threatens your life. So this is why hypervigilance emerges after emotional abuse. And because emotional abuse comes from another person, as opposed to like PTSD that might develop after being attacked by a dog, or possibly a tree fell on you, you got into a car accident, when emotional abuse is involved, it's involving another person, and this adds a little extra layer to things. So now, instead of the thing that you're fearing being like a catastrophe, some kind of event that you couldn't have foreseen, this happened to somebody that you know. And it didn't just happen to somebody that you know, it happened with somebody who you probably trusted, who was either a part of your family, and part of their obligation as part of your family is to look after you if they're a parent especially, or it happened with a loved one. It happened on an intimate level where you're already vulnerable and you're open to whatever abuse they're throwing at you. When this happens and we develop trauma symptoms as a result of it, we develop them in reaction to people, and we start becoming hypervigilant towards people and noticing the way that people behave. I know from my own life, when I've been emotionally abused, I started to learn what kind of things do people do before they abuse me, and I've noticed what are the things that they say, how do they walk, what kind of way will they approach me, and I started to hypervigilantly look for these things so that I could be prepared if they were going to go into emotional abuse or further continue that into physical abuse. And this can even progress from hypervigilance into something like paranoia, where you start expecting that people are going to hurt you, where just being around people makes you feel like you are threatened and you're going to be hurt. But the focus of this video is not paranoia, it's hypervigilance, and we're going to talk more about that. So I just mentioned how after emotional abuse we become hypervigilant to other people and what they're doing, and we start to notice their behaviors and their actions and the way that they approach us. But something else that we do is we pay close attention to our own experience and our own feelings and what we think our feelings are telling us. And part of the problem with that is when we have trauma and PTSD symptoms, our symptoms are over-exaggerated and we're reacting a little bit too strongly to things. For example, we have an exaggerated startle response, and what that means is when something frightens us, it frightens us more than it should frighten somebody. So if somebody were to come up behind us and we didn't notice them, for example, anybody would be startled by that and would kind of like have a little bit of a reaction. But somebody who's been traumatized has a stronger reaction to that, and they have a similar reaction when it comes to emotions and their experience that they're experiencing internally. So when somebody comes to them and they say something, let me think of an example here. So a simple example that might happen at home could be something like, well, did you put this in the refrigerator? And that's a benign question. That doesn't really mean anything. There's just a question, did you put it in the refrigerator? But somebody who's been traumatized might hear that, and they might see it as an accusation instead of a question. And they hear that. Inside, they feel this fear, this sense of terror, this sense of, are they accusing me? Do I need to get back at them? Do I need to run away? There's this, their amygdala is going off and they're hypersensitive to things. And so they listen to that feeling, and that feeling tells them this isn't safe. And so going by that feeling, they behave accordingly, and they say no with a nasty tone, or they accuse, well, why are you at, they lose rationality and they start to behave as though they're being attacked when they're really not being attacked. It's simply a question. This is something that I find really difficult when talking with people who've been traumatized, is you want to understand their situation, you want to ask them questions, but a lot of people find questions very threatening when they've been through something like child abuse. Now, this combination of being hypervigilant to what other people are doing and becoming hypervigilant to our own internal reaction and emotional experience to what other people are doing makes it really difficult to have intimacy. And this is one of the core areas where people have problems with personality disorders. They have difficulty with intimacy, and they also have difficulty with empathy. And this is where I think it gets in the way, because people who have been through trauma, they have difficulty empathizing because they're feeling this internal fear and they just naturally don't trust people. And when you have that fear of people and distrust of people, it's really hard to become intimate. It's hard to become vulnerable and connect with them on a deeper level, because there's always this sense in the back of your mind, this hypervigilant sense of, is this safe? Am I going to be okay? Is this somebody I can trust? And typically the answer is going to be no, because your survival system is trying to protect you, and it's still remembering that past trauma. And until we deal with that past trauma and get rid of the hypervigilance, it makes it really difficult to have interpersonal relationships with anybody. So what do we do about this problem when we have hypervigilance after emotional abuse? Well, we see how this affects our interpersonal relationships. What we need to do is to have positive relationships with people, and we can do this in practice, of course, ideally with a therapist. But even outside of therapy, we need to practice this with just people in our lives, people that we know we can trust. So we need to get in touch with our feelings and start to question, when are we actually feeling hypervigilant for a positive reason, for an adaptive reason, because somebody really is a threat, and when are they actually not really threatening us? And we can do this through getting opinions from people who we do trust, and we can do this by spending time around people who we do trust, who we know in the past they have not harmed us, they're not looking to harm us. And forming those positive relationships will start to diminish some of that hypervigilance. Now, something else that's critical is dealing with that original trauma. Every time that trauma triggers, every time whatever it is that's got you hypervigilant in the first place activates you, you're going to be looking for threats, and you're going to have difficulty with relationships. So you've got to deal with that original anxiety, and that is something that's best done with the therapist again, but you can always explore on your own. Now, if you're somebody who's been through emotional abuse, you probably have low self-esteem. I have some free worksheets over on my Patreon page that you can check out. They help you with self-esteem. I'll put the link up here. And if you're on board with my mission of humanizing mental health, you can also support me over on Patreon, so check that out. If you're somebody who's new here, you want to learn more about this topic, I have many other videos on it. Hit subscribe and hit the bell after you hit subscribe to get notified every time that I do a video. And if you're somebody who's experienced hypervigilance after emotional abuse, please share your experience below. Share what's worked for you, how you've learned to trust people again, because I know there are a lot of people out there who need help with this, and through discussing it together, we can learn from each other. As always, I want to thank you for being here with me, and I'll see you around, everyone.